What if I told you Viking berserkers weren't the unstoppable monsters Hollywood sells us? The truth is much stranger. Real berserkers were feared for their trance-like states in battle. Some historians think this came from rituals involving henbane seeds, a plant found in archaeological digs near warrior graves. Experiments with henbane show it can dull pain and trigger wild, unpredictable behavior, which lines up with old Norse descriptions. But here's where it gets interesting. Viking leaders used these stories as propaganda. Chroniclers and sagas described berserkers in terrifying detail, building a reputation that was as much psychological warfare as brute force. And if you think the myth stopped there, just wait until you see what Hollywood did to Viking helmets. Let's talk about one of history's most persistent lies, the horned Viking helmet. The image is everywhere, in cartoons, movies, and even sports mascots. But if you look at what archaeologists have actually found, the truth is a lot less flashy. Out of all the Viking graves ever uncovered, only one complete helmet has been found. It's the Jernmundbu helmet from Norway, and it's basically a rounded iron cap with a nose guard. No horns, no wild decorations, just pure function. So where did the horned helmet idea come from? It wasn't the Vikings themselves. The myth really took off in the 1800s, thanks to artists and stage designers who wanted to make their Viking characters look extra dramatic. Richard Wagner's famous operas, especially his Ring cycle, put horned helmets front and center, and audiences loved it. Soon, the image spread through paintings and national pride movements, especially in Scandinavia. But those artists weren't basing their designs on real Viking artifacts. They were creating a look that was more about spectacle than history. If you're picturing a Viking trying to fight with horns jutting out from his helmet, think about how impractical that would be. Horns would catch on shields, tree branches, or even other warriors. In a real fight, they'd give your enemy something to grab or twist, making you an easy target. Vikings built ships that crossed open seas and weapons that held up in battle. They weren't about to sabotage themselves with clumsy gear. Some people point to the Vixo helmets from Denmark as evidence, but these are from the Bronze Age, nearly 2,000 years before the Vikings. They were probably used in ceremonies, not in combat, and they were buried as offerings. Still, these helmets keep popping up in modern media as proof of Viking horned helmets. That's like using a samurai's armor to represent a modern soldier, completely out of place and time. So why does this myth keep going? It's simple. Horned helmets look cool. They make Vikings instantly recognizable, even if it's totally wrong. Movies, TV shows, and video games use them because the image sticks in your mind. But every time they do, they just make it harder for the real story to get through. Actual Viking helmets were all about survival. The Jernmundbu helmet is the best example. Iron plates, rounded top, nose guard, and sometimes a mail curtain for neck protection. Only the wealthiest warriors could afford something like this. Most Vikings probably fought in leather caps, or even bareheaded. Horns weren't just rare, they were non-existent. Even the idea of fancy decorations is a stretch. Maybe some helmets had engravings, but nothing that would get in the way during a fight. Vikings needed gear that worked, not gear that looked good in a parade. Their helmets were tools, not costumes. So, if the horned helmet is a myth, what about the rest of their gear? Let's break down what real Vikings actually took onto the battlefield. When it comes to Viking weapons, reality is a lot more practical, and honestly more interesting, than the myths. Most warriors didn't march into battle swinging fancy swords. The workhorse of the Viking arsenal was the spear. These weren't just backup weapons, they were the main event. Spears were cheap, easy to make, and deadly in trained hands. The typical Viking spear had a wooden shaft about 2 to 3 meters long, topped with an iron tip. Some were designed for throwing, with tips around 30 centimeters, while others were made for thrusting, with longer blades. That long reach gave Vikings a serious advantage, whether they were fighting on ships or in tight shield formations. If you dig up a Viking grave, odds are you'll find a spearhead, sometimes several, because spears outnumbered any other weapon by a mile. Axes come in right after spears for sheer popularity. Forget the giant, double-bladed axes from video games. Most Viking axes were one-handed, light and fast. A typical axe weighed less than a kilogram, with a curved iron blade and a wooden handle. The design wasn't just for chopping. Those pointed tips let a warrior hook an enemy's shield or even pull someone off balance. There were bigger axes too, like the Danish axe, but even those were built for speed, not brute strength. The axe was a tool as much as a weapon, which made it a practical choice for everyday Vikings. And they were effective. Just look at the story from Stamford Bridge in 1066, where a lone Norse axeman held off a crowd of English soldiers, swinging his axe until he was finally overwhelmed. Now, swords, those were a different story. Owning a sword was like owning a luxury car. Viking swords were double-edged, about 90 centimeters long, and often decorated with silver or copper inlay. They were expensive to make, and even more expensive to buy. Most of the time, swords were passed down as heirlooms or taken as trophies from fallen enemies. If you had a sword, you made sure everyone knew about it. Still, even warriors who owned swords often chose spears or axes in actual combat. Swords were symbols of status, not standard issue. It's easy to see where the myths come from. Old sagas love to focus on named swords and epic duels. But archaeology tells a different story. Most Viking graves have spearheads and axes, not swords. Metallurgy studies show that many Viking swords were imported from Frankish lands and then reworked by Norse smiths. That's why you sometimes find broken swords in graves. They were too valuable to just toss away, even if they couldn't be used anymore. Weapons weren't just tools for killing. They were a way to show your place in society. Chieftains might carry decorated swords, but the average fighter relied on practical, affordable gear. The real power of the Vikings came from their organization and discipline, not from flashy weapons. And when you picture Viking combat, don't think of wild, chaotic battles. The real secret was how they fought together, turning simple weapons into an unstoppable force. Picture this. You're packed in tight with dozens of others, shields overlapping, every muscle tense as you brace for impact. This was the reality of the Viking shield wall, a formation built on discipline, not chaos. Forget the wild swinging you see in movies. Real Viking battles were all about holding the line, following commands, and trusting the person next to you not to break under pressure. If one man panicked or slipped, the whole wall could buckle, turning order into disaster. The shield wall worked because of how simple and effective it was. Each warrior's round wooden shield overlapped with his neighbor's, creating a solid barrier. The front row crouched a bit, so the line behind could brace against them, making the formation even stronger. Spears poked out between the shields, ready to jab at anyone who got close, while axes and swords waited for the enemy to close in. With enough training, these formations could move forward or back as a single unit, adjusting to the flow of battle. The weakest link was always the first to go. Discipline mattered more than brute strength. Vikings didn't just stand and wait. They used formations like the boar's snout, a wedge designed to punch through enemy lines. The point man took the brunt of the attack, but the men behind gave support, pushing forward until the wedge broke through. Once inside, the rest followed, turning a defensive line into a rout. This wasn't about glory for one hero, it was about timing and teamwork. Archaeology backs up just how brutal these battles could be. Skeletons from old battlefields show wounds to the back and sides, proof that when a shield wall broke, chaos followed. Most casualties happened during retreats or after a formation collapsed, not in the initial clash. Crushed skulls and spear wounds in the back tell the story of what happened when discipline failed. Those who stuck together stood a better chance of surviving. Most Vikings weren't full-time warriors. They were farmers, craftsmen, or traders who picked up weapons when raiding season came around. Still, they practiced. Local assemblies doubled as training grounds, where young men learned to hold the line in the back ranks before moving forward as they gained experience. Coordination and experience kept the wall strong. Knowing when to close a gap or shift position was key. Hollywood sometimes gets the look of the shield wall, right, but misses the discipline. Real formations had to balance spacing. Too close, and you couldn't swing a weapon. Too loose, and the wall fell apart. Leaders shouted orders, constantly adjusting the line. The best crews moved almost instinctively, reacting to threats and keeping the formation tight. Other formations added variety. The swine was a wider version of the wedge, used in open fields to keep a solid front while allowing for movement. Smaller groups might use the filking, spacing out just enough for weapons to swing, but still overlapping shields. Every setup balanced protection with the need to attack. Vikings also used deception. Sometimes, they'd fake a retreat, luring enemies out of their own formation. When their opponents chased, the Vikings would turn and strike, catching them off guard. It worked because most enemies weren't as disciplined. Once their lines broke, it was over. The real lesson from Viking battles is that survival depended on collective discipline, not lone heroes. A single berserker might scare a few opponents, but a well-drilled shield wall won battles and made Viking raids so effective. But what really set the Vikings apart wasn't just their tactics on the battlefield, it was how they turned warfare into a business, targeting wealth where it was least defended. Viking raids weren't random acts of destruction. They were calculated, profit-driven operations. If you picture a silent monastery on a coastal cliff, filled with gold chalices, jeweled manuscripts, and barrels of wine, you're seeing what the Vikings saw, an opportunity. These sites weren't fortified, and the monks inside had no weapons, just faith that their prayers would protect them. For the Vikings, monasteries were soft targets, loaded with wealth, and almost no risk. The famous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 wasn't about disrespecting religion. It was about hitting the medieval equivalent of an unlocked vault. Monasteries lined trade routes and rivers, making them easy to reach and even easier to rob. The pattern of these raids was almost businesslike. Vikings timed their attacks with the seasons. They sailed out in spring when the seas were calm and returned before winter, hitting the same regions year after year. They followed trade routes, striking when harvests and tides filled monastery stores. Sometimes they demanded payment, Danegeld, to leave a town untouched. Pay up, and they'd move on. Refuse, and you'd lose everything. It was organized extortion, not senseless violence. But the real money wasn't always in gold. The Vikings saw people as valuable cargo. Capturing slaves was often more profitable than taking treasure. Raiding parties targeted villages and monasteries for able-bodied men, skilled workers, and anyone who could fetch a good price in the slave markets of Dublin or even as far as Baghdad. Women and children were especially prized. Irish sources tell of thousands taken in a single season. The slave trade wasn't just a side hustle, it was a core part of the Viking economy, fueling more raids and bigger ships. Monasteries kept getting hit because they didn't, or wouldn't, defend themselves. Kings built fortresses, but monks rebuilt on the same exposed sites, trusting in divine protection. Vikings took advantage of this, launching surprise attacks at dawn and vanishing with loot and captives before any help could arrive. Even the monks' own records admit how vulnerable they were. Still, the cycle repeated. Rebuild, restock, and get raided again. Vikings weren't just after loot. They were open to negotiation. If they captured someone important, a noble or a bishop, they'd send a ransom demand, sometimes down to the last coin or cask of wine. These deals were usually honored. A reputation for keeping your word meant future victims were more likely to pay up without a fight. It was pragmatic, not personal. Over time, short-term raids turned into long-term plans. Vikings set up bases, overwintered, and eventually settled down, turning temporary camps into permanent towns. In places like Normandy and eastern England, they went from raiders to rulers, blending with local populations and taxing the people they once attacked. The shift from hit-and-run tactics to settlement shows just how adaptable and ambitious these Norse entrepreneurs could be. Their success relied on speed and surprise. Viking ships let them land almost anywhere, strike fast, and disappear before anyone could mount a defense. They even sailed up rivers to reach inland targets, always looking for the next weak spot. By the time defenders showed up, the Vikings were already gone. For all the terror they inspired, the Vikings were strategic, organized, and always looking for the next advantage. Their reputation for brutality hid a sharp sense of business. But if you think these raiders fit the stereotype of filthy barbarians, you might be surprised by what archaeologists have found in their graves. Let's get into the real story of Viking hygiene. Archaeologists keep finding grooming kits in Viking graves, sometimes more often than weapons. These weren't just combs tossed in for good luck. We're talking full sets. Combs, tweezers, razors, and ear picks, sometimes worn on belts or hung from chains. The tools themselves were often carved from antler or bone, decorated with patterns, or inlaid with metal. Some combs even came in fitted wooden cases. If you saw a Viking with a fancy comb, it was as much about status as it was about keeping clean. Vikings cared about their appearance, and the evidence is everywhere. Laws in Iceland made it illegal to humiliate someone by messing with their hair or making them dirty. That was seen as a real attack on their reputation. Graves sometimes have more than one comb, and women's burials often include beauty kits, bone needles for hair, little bags for pigments, and even razors. This wasn't just vanity. Living on crowded ships and in close quarters, they needed to keep lice and disease in check. Regular grooming was a survival tactic as much as a style choice. Bathing was a regular thing. The Old Norse word for Saturday, lagerdagur, literally means bathing day. Every week, Vikings set aside time to clean up. In Iceland, archaeologists have found remains of heated bathhouses. Think early saunas. In towns like Jorvik, modern York, there's evidence of latrines and even basic sewage systems, a step up from the open ditches found elsewhere in Europe. The wealthy might have used cloth for cleaning, while everyone else made do with leaves or hay. Travelers who met the Vikings sometimes got the wrong idea. Ibn Fadlan, an Arabic diplomat, wrote that the Rus, a group of Vikings, were filthy by his standards. He didn't like that they shared the same washing water. But even his account mentions that they washed their faces and combed their hair every day, which was more than most Europeans did at the time. Anglo-Saxon neighbors actually joked about how excessively clean the Vikings were, taking weekly baths when others thought water was dangerous. Vikings also protected their looks with the law. If you cut someone's hair or made them dirty to shame them, you could be exiled. That's how seriously they took personal appearance. Some even used lye soap to bleach their beards or styled their hair with beeswax. Their wool clothing helped too. It was naturally antimicrobial, which meant less odor and fewer bugs compared to the linen worn by most Europeans. Scientists studying lice from Viking combs found fewer parasites than on those from London or Paris. Viking graves also show less tooth decay, hinting at better oral hygiene. And while medieval towns reeked of open sewers, Viking settlements had cleaner setups and even public bathhouses in port towns for arriving crews. So, when you picture a Viking, forget the filthy brute stereotype. These were people who valued cleanliness, protected their appearance by law, and took practical steps to stay healthy. But even the cleanest Viking could have a wild side, especially when it came to the mysterious Berserkers, whose reputation for chaos and violence has become legend. Berserkers, the truth behind the myth. These warriors have become a symbol of Viking chaos, but the reality behind their legend is more complex than the movies let on. Historical sources describe Berserkers as fighters who entered trance-like states on the battlefield, not mindless brutes, but men who used altered states and ritual to terrify their enemies. The old sagas talk about berserkers fighting without armor, biting their shields, and acting as if they couldn't feel pain. Instead of magic, a lot of this behavior probably comes down to chemistry. Henbane, a plant that grows wild in Scandinavia, contains hallucinogens that can numb pain, distort vision, and trigger bursts of aggression. Archaeologists have found henbane seeds in Viking warrior graves, and experiments show that even small doses can dull pain and ramp up unpredictable behavior. Other plants like fly agaric mushrooms and bog myrtle beer might have played a role too. These substances didn't make anyone invincible, but they did make berserkers unpredictable and hard to stop. Berserkers rarely acted alone. They formed small groups, sometimes called berserker gangs, and often worked as elite shock troops. Before a fight, they'd go through rituals, chanting, howling, or working themselves into a frenzy. To anyone facing them, it looked like pure madness. But even when they weren't under the influence, the berserker reputation did half the work. Just knowing berserkers might be on the field could shake enemy morale and cause lines to break. Of course, there were downsides. These trance states left berserkers drained. Sagas mention them collapsing after battle, sometimes sleeping for days. The drugs masked pain and exhaustion, but when the effects faded, injuries caught up fast. Some likely died from wounds they didn't feel at the moment. Berserkers were not universally admired. In fact, laws in medieval Iceland banned berserker behavior, calling it excessive violence. Sagas often show them as dangerous outsiders, bullies who demanded tribute from villages, not heroes to be celebrated. Communities feared them as much as their enemies did. Viking leaders knew how to use berserkers. They'd send them in first to disrupt enemy formations, hoping the shock would break the line. Sometimes it worked, especially against inexperienced troops. But against disciplined opponents, berserkers could be outmaneuvered. The story of Stamford Bridge tells how a lone berserker held a bridge against the English until a soldier stabbed him from below. Fury alone couldn't win the day. Religion played a part, too. Berserkers claimed the god Odin gave them their battle frenzy, which added a layer of authority to their actions. Disobeying a leader wasn't just insubordination, it was seen as defying the gods. Over time, the myth grew. Later writers exaggerated their feats, making them seem supernatural. By the 1200s, stories turned berserkers into shapeshifters and monsters. The original reality was simpler: chemically altered fighters, used for shock and fear, not magic. So if the real berserkers were nothing like the stories, why do these myths stick around? The answer has a lot to do with who rewrote Viking history. And why. Over time, the Viking image we know today became a patchwork of myths, propaganda, and pop culture shortcuts. The roots of these distortions run deep, right through the 19th and 20th centuries, when nationalist movements in Scandinavia and Germany looked to the Vikings for a sense of identity. They cherry-picked the parts of Viking history that fit their agenda, turning raiders and traders into symbols of pure heroism and strength. Artists and writers painted Vikings as towering, blonde warriors. Never mind that actual Norse people were a mix of backgrounds and looked nothing like the stereotypes. The noble savage idea stuck, casting Vikings as fearless, untamed heroes, even as the real history was far more complicated. Richard Wagner's operas cranked up the drama. In the late 1800s, his Ring cycle gave the world Valkyries in horned helmets, sweeping music, and a vision of Norse legend that was more theater than fact. These images caught on fast, especially as nationalism swept across Europe. Suddenly, Vikings weren't just historical figures. They were icons of destiny and racial pride, used to inspire unity or justify exclusion. By the 1930s, the Nazis took this myth and ran with it. They used Viking symbols to build their story of Aryan supremacy, ignoring the actual diversity of Viking society. This version of history didn't fade after the war. It echoed in books, movies, and even school lessons. Hollywood and post-war media made things even simpler. Films like The Vikings 1958 and countless cartoons boiled Norsemen down to action heroes with horned helmets and axes, always ready for a fight. The real people, farmers, traders, and poets, got pushed aside for the sake of a good story. The horned helmet became a visual shortcut, like a cowboy hat or a pirate's eye patch. It didn't matter that archaeology proved it wrong. The Jörmungandr helmet, the only complete Viking helmet ever found, is just a plain iron dome with a nose guard. But the fantasy version is more fun to draw, so it keeps showing up in games, movies, and even museum gift shops. This isn't just about helmets. The myths around berserkers, Viking purity, and endless raiding all survive, because they're easy to remember and make for better stories. They're also useful for people who want simple heroes or villains. Even now, far-right groups try to claim Viking symbols as their own, ignoring DNA evidence and historical records that show the Norse world was full of outsiders, immigrants, and trade. Modern Scandinavia faces a tricky balance. There's pride in Viking heritage, but also a need to tell the full story, one that includes violence, trade, poetry, and migration. Reenactors and historians spend a lot of time correcting the record, showing that the Vikings were more than just warriors with axes. DNA studies reveal traders with brown hair, dark eyes, and roots across Europe and Asia, but the market still prefers the old myths. What we think we know about the Vikings says more about us than about them. Each generation reshapes their story to fit the needs of the moment. But if you really want to understand how the Vikings became so influential, you have to look at what made them succeed in the first place. Here's the kicker. Vikings didn't win just by swinging swords. Their real strength was adaptability, shifting from raiders to traders, then settling as rulers. In places like Ireland and Normandy, they didn't just take over. They blended in, married locals, and often became the new elite. That's the story most people miss. Practical decisions, not just legendary strength, shaped their legacy. Which myth caught you off guard? Was it the clean Vikings, the drug-fueled Berserkers, or something else? Drop it in the comments. Next time you spot a horned helmet, remember, real Viking history is stranger and smarter than the myths.